All right, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to be looking at long-run economic growth, and that's all in Chapter 25 of your textbook, pages 642 to 652. And when we start talking about growth, what we want to talk about is how do we measure growth, and what are some of the sources of growth in the long run, and how changes in productivity can be illustrated graphically to show this kind of economic growth. So when we talk about growth, we're talking about real GDP per capita. That's how economists generally measure it, and they measure it that way because when we look at GDP, that just looks at the size of the economic pie. How big is your economy? But that doesn't necessarily give us an indication of living standards. And we could say real GDP, and that would be great, and it would certainly be better than regular GDP because it does adjust for the size of inflation to give a sense about purchasing power, but even that's not quite helpful. What is better is this real GDP per capita because it tells us how much of the pie does each person get in real terms. Is the slice of the pie that I get bigger than last year or not? And that answer tells us if the economy is doing well or not. If the answer is yes, then clearly things are growing in ways that we want it to. When we look at the U.S. and its real GDP per capita, we can see that it's grown significantly since 1908. If you look at it in 1908 terms, we're 684% higher than we were 100 years ago, 104 years ago. If you look at it from the perspective of 2008, what we're saying here in the second column is that if you were a median family in 2008, your income was $50,000, which means that in 1908 you would have had about 15% of that for your purchasing power. So basically a 1908 median family would have about $8,000 worth of current dollars to spend on goods and services. And so clearly when you compare 1908 to 2008, we are significantly better off. The question is, how did we get so much better off? And that falls under what we call the rule of 70. And the rule of 70 tells us that basically the number of years it takes to double your economy is equal to 70 divided by the annual percentage rate of growth. And so if you have a 1% annual percentage rate of growth, it will take you 70 years to double the size of your economy. If you were to have a 2% annual growth rate, it would take you 35 years to double the size of your economy. So the more growth you get, the faster your growth, the quicker it will, you're able to double the size of your economy and see some real growth in real GDP per capita. Overall, how is the United States doing when it comes to GDP per capita and growth? Well, if you look at the worldwide average, it's about $10,700 per person, and in the United States we are well above it. In fact, we are the number 7 country in the world at $48,147 GDP per capita. Now, why is the United States so high and there are other countries that are so low? It can pretty much be summed up in 3 simple words: productivity, productivity, and productivity. The more productive people are, the more output they're able to produce per worker, the greater your economic growth. And in fact, that's the only way to have any sort of real sustained growth in your economy is through increased productivity. When we're talking about increasing productivity, we're talking about improvements in 3 things: either human capital, physical capital, or technology. When we talk about human capital, we're talking about education, training, and skills. The more skills you have, the more productive you can become. So if you have a training course on how to use Excel, suddenly you are able to do a whole lot more with financial information because of the increased productivity and knowledge that you have to work. If we're talking about physical capital, we're talking about tools. The better tools you get, the more productive you can be. So if you have to dig a ditch, you can do it with your hand, you can do it with a shovel. If you have the physical capital of the shovel, you're going to be more productive. So the more tools you have, the more productive you become. And we can talk about technology, the improvement in the tools that you may have. And in fact, it's the most important factor in economic growth. So an Apple computer yesterday versus today. The original Apple computer was great for its time, but not remotely as technologically powerful and productive as the iMac is today. So the better your technology, the more productive people can become. In short, if you can give workers more tools, better tools, and the knowledge to know how to use them, you will see some significant long-run growth. In order to see how growth is progressing, we can use what's called an aggregate production function to measure that growth. So a change in productivity, what it measures is a change in productivity given a change in either human capital per worker, physical capital per worker, or technology. The aggregate production function then can be used to graph the increase in output given an increase in any one of those three factors. So if I increase human capital per worker by a certain amount of dollars, how much extra dollars in outcome or output do I generate? And the same with physical capital or changes in technology. So let's just take a quick look at an example. Let's just pretend there are office typists out there and they're busy typing up reports, and so there's no change in physical capital, so there's no change in their output. But let's pretend for a minute that a company spends $1,000 and buys a new computer for them, a new laptop, so that the typist is no longer using a typewriter but a laptop with word processing, in which case that $1,000 investment in physical capital could realistically lead to increased productivity to the tune of, say, $4,000 worth of extra work that they can generate. And maybe if I spent another $1,000 and bought them an even better computer, that I could maybe get an additional $7,000 in output. And if we bought $3,000 of computers per worker, maybe the value of real output is $9,000 from where we were before. And if I spent $4,000 on a computer and it was really, really good, then maybe I would get $10,000 worth of work per typist. So we're seeing that as the physical capital per worker increases, that we're seeing more output for each worker, and we can plot this on a graph where we have real GDP per worker, and on the vertical and on the horizontal is physical capital per worker. And what we see is that as we increase physical capital per worker, we see an increase in real GDP. But what we also see is that real GDP growth actually begins to shrink. So what we see is that GDP increases at a decreasing rate. And if you think about it, that kind of just makes some sense. So in the book, if you read it, there's an example. It talks about a farmer with a tractor. And if the farmer doesn't have a tractor, he's not as productive as if he were to buy one. So if he buys a $30,000 tractor, then that would presumably be more productive than no tractor at all. If he bought a $60,000 tractor that had more features to it and had maybe a bigger engine or a wider combine or something like that, that he would be able to produce more output than he would with the $30,000 tractor. But would he produce twice as much stuff as he did with the $30,000 tractor? Probably not. And if you had a $150,000 tractor, it would be creating more output presumably than one that was worth less. But would it be producing as much as a proportion? And the answer is no. So as we increase physical capital per worker, we see that the increase in productivity that new capital brings begins to decrease over time. So when it comes to the aggregate production function, we see diminishing returns, and it is also based on all things being equal, which means that we're assuming that if I increase physical capital, that I'm holding human capital and technology constant. And so it's just one way of looking at how these different factors will influence long-run economic growth. Now, another way that you can look at the growth of the economy in the long run is by looking at a thing called the production possibilities curve. And in the most simplest version, there are two products that are being produced by an economy. In this case, they're army trucks and cars. And the curve shows us every possible combination of cars and trucks that can be produced by the economy based on what people want. And so if you have a point on the curve, like point B, we say that the economy is being efficient. It's using its resources efficiently. All of the resources are being used to their best use. If you have a point like point F, which is inside the curve, this is inefficient. It's possible, but it is less than what we could have. So essentially, you could argue that maybe if you're at point F, you're at like a recessionary gap, whereas a point like B might be long-run equilibrium. But then there's this other point E, which is not possible currently, given our our resources, and that point cannot be reached, generally speaking, consistently, unless we increase our production possibilities curve. So if we have some sort of long-term growth or long-run growth that increases our ability to permanently make more of any one good or combination of goods, then we see the production possibilities curve shift to the right, and then we begin to incorporate places like point E, which were not possible consistently before, but which are now possible with the resulting long-run growth. And with that, we're going to go ahead and spend the rest of class, when you come in, working on some problems, thinking through some of these concepts, and answering any questions that you guys have. And then I will look forward to seeing you then.